We invented a secret code language as kids, and 15 years later, one text written in that same broken language was the only thing that saved my sister's life. The message came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. 4 words. Frog pond, lily pad. I was sitting on my couch with a bowl of cold pasta balanced on my knee when my phone buzzed against the cushion. I almost didn't look, almost let it sit there until the commercial break. Then I saw the words on the lock screen and my stomach dropped straight through the floor. I hadn't heard that phrase since I was 9 years old. Frog meant help. Pond meant home isn't safe. Lily pad meant come get me. My sister Ivy invented the code in our treehouse the summer she turned 7, the summer our parents fought behind closed doors and pretended we couldn't hear the yelling through the vents. We used it for years. A whisper across the dinner table, a note passed under a door, a single word that meant everything without saying anything at all. We hadn't needed it since I was 13 and Ivy was 10. We'd grown up. We'd stopped needing a code to survive our own house. She had just stacked all 3 warnings into a single text because she didn't have time to type more. I called her. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Same thing. I texted back, "You okay?" and watched the little bubble appear and disappear 3 times before nothing came through at all. My hands were shaking by the 3rd attempt. I grabbed my keys off the counter and I was in my car before I'd fully decided to go anywhere. I drove to her house doing 11 over the speed limit the entire way, running 1 yellow light that had gone red before I cleared the intersection. My knuckles were white on the wheel. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing, that she'd dropped her phone in a drawer and it auto-corrected into gibberish, that I was about to feel foolish standing on her porch at midnight. I didn't believe a word of it. Some part of me, the part that remembered being 9 years old and listening through a vent, already knew. I pulled into her driveway behind the black Range Rover at 12:20 in the morning. Every light in the house was on except the upstairs bedroom, which went dark right as I stepped out of my car. I stood on the porch and rang the bell twice before Weston opened the door in a bathrobe, hair damp like he'd just gotten out of the shower, smiling like I'd shown up in the middle of a nice ordinary Tuesday. "Sasha," he said, "it's late. Where's Ivy?" "Asleep." "Everything's fine." He leaned against the door frame, blocking the hallway behind him with his body in a way that looked casual and wasn't. Down that hallway, a light clicked off fast, like someone had been standing in a doorway and stepped back into the dark. "You want to come in, or are we doing this on the porch?" I didn't move. "I need to see her." At midnight, he laughed, soft and easy, the laugh of a man who had never once been afraid of being believed. "She's got an early morning. Go home. Get some sleep. I'll tell her you stopped by." I stood there for 11 more seconds, staring past his shoulder into a house that had gone very quiet, taking in the 2 wine glasses on the entry table, one full, one already emptied, and then I said fine, and I left, because there was nothing else I could do standing on a stranger's porch with no proof of anything except a 4-word text message that could be explained away 100 different ways. I sat in my car at the end of the block until the sun came up, watching the windows, watching for a shadow, a light, anything. At 7:14 in the morning, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Ivy's real number, her real voice in text form, if a text can have a voice. "Sorry! Dropped my phone in the sink last night, LOL. Everything's good over here." 2 exclamation points where there should have been 0. That wasn't how my sister talked when things were actually good. I sat in my car outside her house, engine off, and I read that message 4 times, and I understood for the first time in my adult life that my sister was in trouble, and that no one was coming to help her but me. I want to tell you how we got here, because the 4 words on my phone that night didn't come out of nowhere. They came from 15 years of history, most of which I only understood in hindsight, and some of which I'm still putting together even now. I'm Sasha. I was 28 the night Ivy sent that text. She was 26. We grew up in a split-level house on Larkspur Avenue in a town called Fairmont, 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place with one good diner and a water tower you could see from every backyard. Our father worked at a distribution warehouse. Our mother did the books for a dentist's office 3 days a week. We weren't poor, but money was a subject that made the air in the house go tight, and it made my father go quiet in a way that was worse than yelling most nights, except for the nights it wasn't. Ivy built the treehouse code the summer she was 7. In July of the year our parents almost split up over a bounced check and a credit card my father didn't know my mother had opened. I was 10. We spent most of that summer up in the oak tree behind the shed, out of earshot, inventing a language nobody else could understand. Frog meant help. Pond meant home isn't safe. Lily pad meant come get me. We used hand signals too, for when we couldn't talk. 2 fingers tapped against your own collarbone meant I'm okay, just watching. A closed fist against your chest meant get out now. We used it that whole summer, whispering it to each other across the dinner table when our father's jaw went tight, tapping it against the bathroom door when our mother locked herself inside and cried too long. It was a stupid kid's game built out of a real kind of fear, and it worked, in the way that kids find ways to survive the houses they're given. By the time I was 13 and Ivy was 10, our parents had settled into an uneasy peace. Not happy, but quiet. The kind of quiet a family learns to live inside. We stopped needing the code. We grew up, went to different colleges 4 years apart, built our separate lives. I moved to the city for a job in logistics. Ivy stayed closer to home, finished a business degree, worked the front desk at a physical therapy clinic. We talked twice a week, usually about nothing. I thought that chapter of our lives, the one where we needed a secret language to survive our own house, was closed for good. Our father, Marcus, worked the loading floor at a regional distribution distribution warehouse for 22 years, the kind of job that ages a man's hands faster than his face. Our mother, Diane, kept the books 3 days a week for a dentist named Dr. Halbrook, whose office smelled like mint and bleach, and where Ivy and I did our homework in the waiting room some afternoons because there was nowhere else for us to be. Money in our house existed as a kind of weather system. Sometimes fine, sometimes a storm. Nobody warned you was coming. My father never hit anyone. I want to be clear about that because I know how these stories tend to get flattened into a single shape, and ours wasn't that shape. It was quieter than that. It was silence that lasted days, doors that closed a little too hard, a tension you learned to read in the set of someone's shoulders before you'd even walked fully into a room. Ivy and I built our code language to survive weather, not violence, which is part of why neither of us recognized violence right away when it eventually showed up wearing a much nicer suit. Ivy met Weston Voss at a friend's engagement party when she was 22. He was 31, already running his own commercial real estate firm, already the kind of man who filled a room the second he walked into it. Black Range Rover, a handshake that lasted half a second too long and squeezed half a pound too hard. He asked our parents for their blessing before he asked Ivy to marry him, which my mother still brings up like it's the most romantic thing she's ever witnessed. He proposed at a restaurant with a view of the harbor, got down on one knee in front of 40 strangers, and Ivy said yes with her hand shaking and tears running down her face, and everyone in that restaurant applauded. And I remember thinking, watching the video she sent me, that she looked less like a woman who'd just gotten engaged and more like a woman who'd just been asked a question she didn't feel like she was allowed to say no to. He proposed on a Friday night in October, and by the following March he'd already picked out the venue, the caterer, and most of Ivy's bridesmaids' dresses, a level of involvement everyone around us described as thoughtful rather than what it actually was. They married the following spring, in April, at a vineyard 40 minutes from Fairmont, 320 guests, a band flown in from 2 states over. My parents loved him instantly and completely. He called my mother Mom by the second date. He fixed my father's gutters one Saturday without being asked, and my father talked about it for a month like Weston had performed surgery. He takes care of things, my father said. He takes care of people. I remember nodding along at Thanksgiving that year, half believing it myself, because Weston was charming in the specific way that makes people stop asking questions. He complimented my mother's cooking. He remembered the names of our cousins' kids. He laughed at my father's jokes even when they weren't funny, and my father, who laughed at almost nothing, laughed back. The changes started small enough that I almost missed them, the way you almost miss a room getting darker if the light fades slowly enough. Ivy stopped coming to Sunday dinner about 8 months after the wedding. First it was, we've got plans, then it was, Weston's got a work thing, then it was nothing, just an empty chair at the table that everyone stopped mentioning. She stopped answering her phone before noon. When I asked her about it once, she laughed and said Weston liked her phone off during their morning routine. Something about presence, about being intentional, phrases that sounded like they'd been handed to her rather than grown from anything she actually believed. She started wearing long sleeves in July, in a house with a pool, at a barbecue where everyone else was in tank tops and shorts. I brought it up to my mother once, carefully, the way you test ice before you put your full weight on it. I said I was worried about Ivy, that she seemed smaller somehow, quieter, like she was performing a version of herself instead of living as one. My mother cut me off before I finished the sentence. Weston provides for her, she said. Do you have any idea how many women would kill for that? You're jealous. You've always been a little jealous of your sister. I let it go. That was mistake number 1, and I've spent a long time since then understanding that it wasn't really my mistake to own. It was the mistake of an entire family culture that had decided a man's providing erased the need to ask any other question about him. But at the time, sitting across from my mother at her kitchen table, I believed her more than I believed my own eyes. I told myself I was projecting old fears from our childhood onto a marriage that had nothing to do with that. I told myself Ivy was fine. I stopped asking. Here's the incident that reads different now than it did then. It was Ivy and Weston's first Christmas married, 13 months before the text. We were all at my parents' house, the whole extended family crammed into that split-level living room, and Ivy dropped a wine glass while clearing the table. It shattered across the hardwood, red wine spreading like something out of a crime scene, and the room went quiet the way rooms do. Weston didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He just looked at her, a long, flat look, and said, low enough that only the people close to them could hear, "We'll talk about this at home." Ivy's face went the color of the tablecloth. She apologized 4 times in the space of a minute, to Weston, to my mother, to the room, to the floor itself, it felt like, and she spent the rest of the night refilling drinks and clearing plates with her shoulders up around her ears, like she was trying to make herself smaller than the mess she'd made. I remember thinking at the time that Weston was being a little intense about a wine glass. I didn't think anything past that. I didn't understand yet that "we'll talk about this at home" was a sentence with teeth, that it was the kind of sentence a man says when he wants a woman to spend an entire car ride in silence, dreading what's waiting for her on the other side of a closed door. 2 years passed between that Christmas and the text message. 2 years in which I saw my sister maybe a dozen times, always with Weston present, always with that half-second delay in her laugh, like she was waiting to see how he reacted before she let herself find something funny. I told myself I was imagining it. I had my own life, my own job, my own relationship falling apart and coming back together. I wasn't watching closely enough, and some nights now, that's the thing that keeps me up. Not what Weston did. what I didn't see in time. The escalation, once I started paying attention, moved faster than I expected, and it moved in a pattern I've since read about in 100 different places, a pattern so common it almost feels insulting to call it unique to my sister's marriage, and yet living inside it felt like nothing anyone had ever survived before. I started keeping a private list on my phone around this time. Dated entries, nothing dramatic, just small factual notes. The yoga excuse, the exclamation points, the way she'd angled her body slightly away from Weston at my cousin's graduation party like she was bracing for something. I didn't know yet what I was building. I only knew I didn't trust my own memory to hold all of it accurately without help, and some instinct told me that someday memory alone wouldn't be enough. The first thing I noticed, once I actually looked, was the money. Weston controlled every account that had Ivy's name on it. Her paycheck from the physical therapy clinic, she'd quit that job 18 months into the marriage, so she could focus on the house. Weston's words, repeated back to me in Ivy's voice like a line she'd memorized, used to go into a joint account. After she quit, there was no more paycheck, and the joint account became, functionally, Weston's account with her name attached to it for tax purposes. She asked his permission before she went out for coffee with me. Not permission exactly, she'd never have called it that, but she'd text him first. Meeting Sasha for coffee, back by 11, and she wouldn't leave until his reply came through. I watched her do it once, sitting across from her at a diner in Fairmont, watching her thumb hover over the send button, watching her visibly relax when 3 dots appeared and then a single word, K. I asked her about it gently, and she laughed it off. He just likes to know where I am. It's sweet, actually. Some guys don't care at all. I didn't push. I told myself that was mistake number 1 all over again, and it was. But by then, I'd learned that pushing too hard too fast just gave Ivy a reason to defend him harder, to close the door I was trying to open. The second thing was a bruise. Early spring, 15 months before the text, I picked Ivy up for a hair appointment and noticed a ring of yellow-green bruising circling her left wrist, mostly hidden under the cuff of her jacket except when she reached for her seatbelt. I asked what happened. She said she'd tried a new yoga class, some advanced flow, and had landed wrong on a wrist stand. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror as she said it, like she was checking whether I believed her before she'd finished the sentence, which is not a thing people do when they're telling the truth. I let her tell me the yoga story. I didn't argue, but I started paying attention to her wrists after that, the way you start noticing something once you know to look. The third thing was the isolation, which crept in so gradually I couldn't point to a single day it happened. Weston didn't forbid Ivy from seeing her friends. He was smarter than that, smart enough to know that an outright rule creates a fight he might lose. Instead, he made every outing cost something. He'd get quiet for 2 days after she spent an evening with her college roommate. He'd bring up, unprompted, all the things he'd done for her that week, the car payment, the credit card, the vacation he was planning, right after she mentioned wanting to see a friend, so that going out started to feel like an act of ingratitude instead of a normal part of having a life. Her friend group shrank from a dozen names to 3, then to 1, then by the time of the text, mostly to me, and even I had to schedule around a system designed to make spending time with me feel like a transaction Ivy owed an explanation for. The fourth thing was the credit cards. 8 months before the text, at a family barbecue at my parents' house, Weston made a show, and I do mean a show, performed for an audience of 12 relatives standing around a grill, of cutting up one of Ivy's store credit cards with kitchen shears. He framed it as a joke about her spending, said something like, "Gotta keep my girl from bankrupting us," and the whole yard laughed, my father loudest of all, and Ivy laughed too, a beat behind everyone else, her face bright red. I watched her hands while everyone else watched Weston's little performance. She was gripping the hem of her shirt so hard her knuckles had gone white. Later that night, helping clear plates, I found the cut-up pieces of the card still sitting in the kitchen trash, and I noticed it wasn't an old, unused card at all. It was the one Ivy had used 2 days earlier to buy groceries, cut apart mid-cycle in front of an audience, for no reason except to make a point stick. That was the day I understood, on some level I didn't have language for yet, that Weston wasn't managing money. He was managing consequences, making sure Ivy remembered, in front of witnesses, exactly who paid for the life she was living, so that any thought of leaving it came preloaded with the fear of losing everything. The fifth thing, the one that finally cracked something open in me, happened 4 months before the text. Ivy called me at 6 a.m. on a Saturday, crying so hard I could barely understand her. Weston had locked her out of the house the night before in the rain because she'd texted me back within 30 seconds of my message instead of waiting until he'd finished whatever he was doing. She'd stood on the porch for 40 minutes in October rain before he let her back in, and when she came inside, soaked through, he told her she'd brought it on herself by prioritizing her phone over her marriage. By the time she called me the next morning, she'd already rebuilt the story in her head into something reasonable, something that was at least partly her fault. "I shouldn't have texted you back so fast," she said. "I know how that looks to him." I sat on my kitchen floor and listened to my sister apologize for the rain. That was the phone call where I finally understood I couldn't wait for Ivy to leave on her own. Confronting Weston directly would have been satisfying for exactly the length of time it took him to smile at me and deny everything, and it would have given him days, maybe weeks, to prepare Ivy for questions, to get ahead of any story she might tell, to punish her privately for whatever I'd said publicly. Men like Weston don't get caught by confrontation. They get caught by evidence, and by the time I understood that, I'd already started collecting a detail I didn't know yet would matter. A name. Weston kept a locked drawer in his home office, and once, helping him carry boxes in for a move-related project, I saw a manila folder inside it labeled, in his own handwriting, V Holdings, confidential. I didn't think much of it at the time. I filed it away the way you file away anything strange that doesn't fit the story you're currently telling yourself. 2 months before the text, I got Ivy alone at a nail salon in the next town over, away from the house, away from any camera Weston might have installed, away from anyone who might report back to him what she said. I asked her straight out, no warm-up, because I'd learned by then that warm-ups just gave her time to build a wall. Is he hurting you? She stared at the polished bottles on the shelf for a long time. Then she nodded, once, and the tears started before she said a single word. She told me everything in about 20 minutes, in a low, fast voice, like she'd been holding the words behind her teeth for years, and they came out all at once now that the dam had cracked. The screaming had started the day after their wedding, not before, never before, which she said like it was somehow a defense of him, like the fact that he'd waited until the ring was on made it less calculated instead of more. He tracked her phone, had since month 3, an app disguised as a fitness tracker that she hadn't known to look for until she found it by accident. He cut up her cards not as a joke, but as a system, a reset button he pulled whenever he felt she was gaining too much independence. And then she told me about the night, 6 weeks earlier, that he'd grabbed her by the throat against the kitchen counter, over something so small she couldn't even remember what had started it, and told her, inches from her face, that nobody would ever believe her over him. That was the night she'd sent me the text. Frog, pond, lily pad. She'd typed it under the counter with her phone hidden against her thigh, and then she'd deleted the conversation, and then she'd told him she'd dropped her phone in the sink. I asked her to leave. Right then that day, I told her she could stay with me, that I'd help her figure out the rest. She shook her head, and what she said next has stayed with me since. If I leave with nothing but a story, he'll spin it before I even finish packing. Weston had spent 3 years building a narrative among our parents, his family, half the neighborhood. Ivy was fragile, dramatic, prone to what he called episodes. He'd planted that story so carefully, so patiently, that Ivy herself half believed it some days. She needed proof, something even our own mother couldn't wave off with a shrug and a line about how marriage is complicated. So I got her proof. I bought a recorder disguised as a phone charging brick from a website that specialized in exactly that kind of thing. The kind of website with a disclaimer at the bottom about state consent laws that I read 3 times to make sure what we were about to do was legal in ours. It was one-party consent. Ivy only needed her own knowledge that she was recording, not Weston's. I met her in the parking lot of a grocery store 2 towns over and showed her how to use it, how to plug it into the wall in the kitchen like it was charging her phone, how to swap it out every few days and hand me the full one in a shopping bag folded inside a box of tampons, because Weston never once looked inside a box of tampons in his life. 3 weeks. That's how long it took. 3 weeks of Ivy living inside a house with a man who might kill her, wearing a wire made of plastic and a lie, waking up every morning and deciding to survive one more day of evidence gathering instead of one more day of just surviving. I think about those 3 weeks more than almost anything else in this whole story. I think about what it costs a person to stay somewhere dangerous on purpose, with intention, because leaving too early meant leaving with nothing. The recordings were worse than what she'd told me at the nail salon because a story is one thing and a voice is another. There was a recording from the second week, 11 minutes long, where Weston called her worthless 4 separate times, told her she'd be nothing without him, told her that her own family thought she was unstable, that he'd heard it straight from your mother's mouth, a claim I still don't know if I believe, but that landed like a gut punch when I heard it played back. There was a recording from the 3rd week, the one that mattered most, where he brought up the wine glass Christmas, casual, almost affectionate in tone, and said, "You remember what happens when you embarrass me?" And Ivy's voice, small and fast, said, "I know, I'm sorry." And he said, "Say it again." And she said it again. And he said, "Louder," and she said it louder, and I had to stop the recording and sit on my bathroom floor for 10 minutes before I could keep listening. And there was the recording that confirmed the wrist. Not the Christmas wrist, a later one, from a fight about her phone. His voice, flat, almost bored. "You grabbed at me first. I barely touched you." Her voice quiet. "You left marks, Weston." A long pause, then his voice again, colder. "Marks heal. Watch your tone." I had 3 weeks of this on a flash drive by the time Weston announced the gala. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. It was his firm's 5-year anniversary, Voss Commercial Holdings, a name he'd put his own on the door of 11 months into starting it, back when Ivy still had a paycheck and he still needed her father-in-law's contacts to get his first 3 contracts signed. The party was at the Fairmont Hills Country Club, the nicest venue in a 40-mile radius, the kind of room with chandeliers and a string quartet, and investors who cared more about how a man's marriage looked than how it actually functioned. Ivy would stand next to him in a dress he'd picked out for her. He'd taken to choosing her clothes for anything public, another detail I hadn't clocked as strange until I understood everything else. Playing the role of the perfect grateful wife one more time for one more room. I RSVP'd the same afternoon the invitation went out. I told no one, not my parents, not my boyfriend, not even Ivy, exactly what I was bringing. I only told her 4 words, the same 4 words she'd sent me 6 weeks earlier, so she'd know I was coming and so she'd know why. The night of the gala, I wore black, the kind of dress that photographs well and hides a lot underneath it. I taped a backup flash drive inside the lining of my bra, the original safely with a lawyer already, a woman named Renata Cole who specialized in domestic violence cases and who had listened to 11 minutes of that recording in her office 2 days earlier and gone very quiet before she said, "This is more than enough to get her a protective order tonight if she wants it." I carried Ivy's recorder in my clutch, freshly charged, one more layer of proof in case anything that happened at that party needed its own record. Weston greeted me at the door with that same handshake, half a second too long, half a pound too hard. "Sasha," he said, warm as ever, like a man who has never once been afraid of being believed. "So glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss it," I said, and I meant it in a way he had no idea about. I found Ivy near the champagne table 20 minutes later, her knuckles white around the stem of a glass she wasn't drinking from. She was wearing the dress he'd chosen, deep red, cut to flatter him more than her, the kind of dress that photographs well on a man's arm. I leaned in like I was fixing her earring, my mouth close to her hair, and I whispered the 4 words. Frog, pond, lily pad. Her whole body went still, the way a deer goes still, and then her eyes met mine, and for the first time in 2 years, I saw my actual sister looking back at me instead of the version of her Weston had built. "Tonight," I whispered. "I promise you, tonight." I didn't get the chance to explain more than that before Weston's business partner, a heavyset man named Doug Aldrich, who'd clearly started drinking before the cocktail hour officially began, sidled up next to me with a fresh scotch in his hand and a loose, friendly grin that men get right before they say something they shouldn't. "You're the sister," he said. "Sasha, right? Weston talks about you." He laughed at nothing in particular. "Man, this whole room. You believe this guy? 5 years from nothing to this." He gestured at the chandeliers, the string quartet, the ice sculpture shaped like the Voss Holdings logo, dripping slowly onto a silver tray. "Started with what? 200 grand seed money from his father-in-law and a business plan on a napkin. Not bad for a guy who lost everything the first time around." I kept my face neutral, the way you learn to when you've spent 3 weeks reading transcripts of your sister's worst nights. "The first time around?" Doug's grin flickered, the specific flicker of a drunk man realizing half a second too late that he'd said something he wasn't supposed to. "Oh, yeah, his first marriage, way before Ivy. Doesn't like people bringing it up. Honestly, I probably shouldn't. He's never mentioned it," I said, which was true and which made something cold settle into my chest. "Vivian," Doug said, lowering his voice like it was a secret worth protecting, or maybe just a secret worth savoring, the way some men savor knowing things others don't. "They were married maybe 3 years, right when he was starting the firm. She left. Real sudden, from what I heard. Moved across the country, cut off contact with basically everyone, family included. Weston says she had some kind of breakdown. Poor guy had to start completely over. Rebuilt everything from scratch." He shook his head, full of a sympathy that made my skin crawl. "That's why this," he said, gesturing at the room again, "means so much to him. Second chance. Ivy's a lucky woman." He wandered off toward the bar before I could ask another question, and I stood there next to the champagne table with the ice sculpture dripping and the string quartet playing something bright and meaningless. And I thought about a manila folder in a locked drawer in Weston's home office, labeled in his own handwriting, V. Holdings, Confidential. I had seen that folder 8 months earlier, helping him carry boxes for a home renovation project, and I had filed it away as nothing, a business thing, a real estate holding company with an unremarkable name. I understood, standing in that ballroom with Doug Aldrich's Scotch breath still in the air, that I had been wrong. V wasn't a holding company. V was Vivian. And whatever was in that folder wasn't real estate paperwork. It was a woman. I found Ivy again by the coat check, pulled her into the alcove behind it where the noise of the party dropped to a low hum, and I asked her, fast and quiet, if she'd ever heard the name Vivian. Ivy's face went white. "Once," she said, "early on. I found a photo in a box in the garage. A wedding photo. Weston in a tux. Some woman I didn't recognize. I asked him about it, and he said it was an old family friend's wedding, that he'd been a groomsman. I believed him. I never thought about it again." She pressed a hand to her mouth. "Sasha, that photo. He was the groom in it. I remember now. He was standing where the groom stands." I felt the entire shape of the last 3 years shift underneath me, like a floor I'd thought was solid turning out to be a thin sheet of ice over something much colder and much deeper than I'd let myself imagine. This wasn't a man who had once, in a moment of stress, lost control of himself with the woman he loved. This was a pattern, a method, a man who had built a life, a fortune, and an entire public identity, devoted husband, self-made success story, generous son-in-law, on the wreckage of a woman he'd already done this to once, a woman who'd fled across the country and cut off her own family rather than risk being found, a woman he now told strangers had simply had a breakdown. I thought about the 11-minute recording. You'd be nothing without me. I thought about the flat, bored voice explaining away bruises. Marks heal. I thought about a folder in a locked drawer, kept for 8 years, tracking God knew what. Assets, a paper trail, insurance against a story ever resurfacing, or maybe just a trophy, a record of a war he considered himself to have won. I didn't know yet exactly what was inside it. I only knew that whatever proof I'd spent 3 weeks gathering against Weston Voss wasn't the first time evidence like it had existed. It was simply the first time anyone had managed to keep it. The microphone squealed with feedback across the ballroom, and the string quartet stopped, and 300 guests turned toward the small stage at the front of the room, where Weston stood with a champagne flute in one hand and a folded index card in the other that he didn't even glance at, because men like Weston don't need notes to perform sincerity. "If everyone could give me just a minute," he said, and the room quieted, and I felt Ivy's hand find mine in the dark of the coat check alcove and grip it hard enough to hurt. 5 years ago, I started this company with a business plan, a used laptop, and a woman who believed in me before anyone else did. He turned toward Ivy, found her across the room, and smiled the smile that had gotten him through every room he'd ever walked into. "Ivy, come up here." I felt her stiffen beside me. "I have to," she whispered. "You don't," I said. "Not this time." She went anyway, because 3 years of training doesn't undo itself in the length of a hallway, and I watched her cross that ballroom in the red dress he'd chosen, chin up, shoulders back, performing composure the way she'd been performing it for 3 years, and I followed 6 steps behind her, close enough to reach her, my thumb already pressed against the recorder in my clutch. Weston took her hand when she reached the stage, raised his champagne flute with the other, and turned back to the room. 15 years from now," he said, his voice warm, practiced, pitched for maximum effect. "I want every person in this room to remember exactly what I'm about to promise this incredible woman." I stepped forward before he could finish the sentence. "Before you promise anything," I said, loud enough to carry, "I think this room should hear what you've already done." The silence that followed wasn't the polite kind. 300 faces turned toward me at once, and I felt every one of them. And I did not look away from Weston's face, which had gone very still, very fast, the smile still technically present but drained of everything behind it. "Sasha," he said low, a warning dressed up as a name. "Not now." "Now," I said, and I pressed play. The recorder wasn't loud enough to fill a ballroom on its own, but I'd planned for that. I'd handed a second copy, hours earlier, to the club's sound technician, along with a $100 bill and a request framed as a surprise for the happy couple. And the moment I said now, Weston's own recorded voice came through the ballroom speakers, clear and unmistakable. 11 seconds of it. All I needed. "You'd be nothing without me." Say it again, louder. And then, layered right after it, the second clip. "You grabbed at me first. I barely touched you. Mark's heel. Watch your tone." 300 people who had spent 5 years believing Weston Voss was a self-made success story built on hard work and a devoted marriage heard, in his own voice, exactly what that marriage actually sounded like behind a closed door. Weston's face did something I'd never seen it do before. The practiced warmth cracked straight down the middle, and underneath it was something colder and more familiar. The same flat look he'd given Ivy over a broken wine glass 3 Christmases ago. "This is a private matter," he said, his voice climbing, control slipping in real time in front of the exact audience he'd spent 5 years cultivating. "You have no right." "I have every right," I said. "She's my sister." Ivy was still standing next to him on that small stage, and something in her had shifted in the 11 seconds since the recording started. I watched it happen, watched 3 years of flinching straighten itself out into something else. She pulled her hand out of his grip and she stepped away from him. 1 step, then 2, putting distance between herself and the man she'd spent 3 years apologizing to in front of witnesses. "He's done this before," I said to the room, to Doug Aldrich standing frozen by the bar with his scotch, to my parents, who I hadn't even seen come in but who I could hear now, my mother's voice somewhere behind me saying, "Sasha, what is this?" There was a wife before Ivy, Vivian. She left this state and cut off contact with her own family, and I think we should all be asking why a man builds a locked file on a woman he claims just had a breakdown. Weston's jaw worked. For 1 long second I watched him calculate, watched his eyes move across the room, cataloging which faces still looked uncertain enough to be won back, which investors might still give him the benefit of the doubt if he found exactly the right sentence fast enough. I watched him search the room for the version of this story he could still sell, and I watched him understand, the way you can sometimes watch a man understand something in real time, that there wasn't one. Not anymore. Not with his own voice still echoing off the chandeliers. "Ivy," he said, and his voice had changed again, gone soft, wounded, reaching for the version of himself that had worked on her for 3 years. "Baby, you know I didn't mean any of that the way it sounds." Ivy looked at him for a long moment. The whole room was holding its breath, waiting, the way rooms do when they sense a true thing is about to be said. "You grabbed me by the throat," she said, her voice shaking but clear, carrying across a ballroom of 300 people who would never again be able to unhear it. "And you told me nobody would believe me over you." She took another step back. "You were wrong." Nobody clapped. Nobody spoke. Somewhere near the bar, I heard Doug Aldrich set his glass down very carefully, like he was afraid of making any sound at all. I remember standing in that ballroom afterward, once the shock had started to loosen its grip on the room, and people began drifting toward the exits in 2s and 3s, avoiding eye contact with each other the way people do when they've just watched something they weren't supposed to see. A club employee turned the music back on at some point, too soon, an upbeat song that felt obscene against what had just happened, and someone turned it back off within a minute. My mother found me near the coat check, her face pale, and she didn't ask what any of it meant. She just put her arms around me and said, "Take me to her." And we walked out to the parking lot together to find Ivy sitting in the passenger seat of my car, still in the red dress, shaking in a way that had nothing left to do with fear. The next 6 weeks moved faster than the 3 years that came before them, the way things do once the truth is finally allowed to exist in the open. Ivy filed for a protective order the following morning, with Renata Cole sitting beside her in a courthouse hallway that smelled like industrial cleaner, and the recordings that had taken 3 weeks of quiet terror to gather were enough, on their own, for the judge to grant it without much deliberation at all. Weston was served divorce papers 11 days after the gala, at his office, in front of his own staff, and I won't pretend I didn't feel something close to joy imagining that particular scene, even though I know that's not the most generous version of myself. The family split down a fault line I hadn't fully predicted. My father, to his enormous credit, believed Ivy within the hour, called Weston something I won't repeat, and drove out to help her move boxes out of that house the very next weekend. His jaw set in a way I hadn't seen since I was a kid listening through a vent. My mother took longer. She'd built 3 years of identity around being the woman whose daughter had married so well, and unbuilding that took her most of a month during which she said things to Ivy that I know she regrets now. Things about overreacting, about marriage being complicated, about wondering if there wasn't some middle ground. Ivy stopped taking her calls for 3 weeks. My mother showed up at my apartment on a Thursday night, sat at my kitchen table, and cried in a way I'd genuinely never seen her cry before, and said, "I did the same thing to her that I did to you, didn't I?" I told her not to trust what she was seeing. I didn't have an answer for her that made either of us feel better. I just sat there and let her say it. The unexpected ally was Doug Aldrich, of all people, who called me 2 weeks after the gala, sober this time, and told me he'd been quietly reviewing the firm's books since that night, because something about the way Weston reacted on that stage had bothered him enough to go looking. He found irregularities, invoices to vendors that didn't exist, a pattern of moving money through an account labeled apparently with the initials VH. That led to a very different kind of investigation than the one Ivy had started, one involving the firm's other investors, and eventually, a state financial crimes unit. It turned out Weston hadn't just been controlling Ivy's money. He'd been quietly siphoning from the company itself for years, funneling it into an account that traced, when the state's forensic accountants finally cracked it open, directly back to a name I'd been thinking about since the ballroom, Vivian. Not a locked-away trophy after all. Or not only that, an ongoing account, still active, still being fed, money moving to a woman 3 states away who, it turned out, had never had a breakdown at all. She'd run, and Weston had spent 8 years quietly paying her, in amounts just large enough and just regular enough to look like guilt money, or hush money, or both. Renata found her, eventually, through the paper trail Doug helped uncover, and Vivian agreed to talk to Ivy's legal team, though not to me directly. Not yet, maybe not ever, which I understood completely. She confirmed enough. The throat grab wasn't unique to Ivy's marriage, it turned out, and neither was the phrase, "nobody will believe you over me," which Vivian said, in a statement I read once and haven't been able to fully shake since. He'd said to her almost word for word, 8 years and 1 wife earlier, in a different kitchen, over a different small thing that had somehow justified his hands around her neck. Weston made a few desperate final moves in those weeks, the kind men make when the story they've spent years constructing collapses faster than they can rebuild it. He tried to get the protective order overturned, claiming Ivy had recorded him illegally, a claim Renata dismantled inside of a single hearing by citing the one-party consent law we'd checked before any of this started. He tried reaching Ivy directly 3 times, texts that swung between apology and threat inside the same paragraph. "I'll get help, I promise." And then 2 lines later, "You'll regret doing this to me." A whiplash that Ivy showed me with her hands shaking, not from fear this time, but from something closer to disbelief that she'd ever mistaken that instability for love. He tried, finally, showing up at my parents' house unannounced on a Sunday, standing in the driveway asking to speak to Ivy, as a family. And my father, quiet, gutter-fixing, gentle jokes only my father, walked out onto that driveway and told him in a voice I genuinely never heard him use that if he came near that house again, he'd be calling the police himself. Weston left. He didn't come back. There was also a smaller, quieter complication that took most of a year to untangle: the house itself. Ivy's name was on the deed, a fact Weston's own lawyer had insisted on early in the marriage for tax reasons that had nothing to do with protecting her, and the fraud investigation into Voss Holdings meant the house couldn't simply be sold or transferred cleanly, while the state's financial crimes unit was still tracing which of Weston's assets had been paid for with stolen investor money. Ivy lived in a kind of legal limbo for months, technically half owner of a house she never wanted to set foot inside again, unable to fully close that chapter until an accountant finished sorting 8 years of falsified invoices into a spreadsheet that would eventually run to over 400 lines. She used to joke darkly that she was more haunted by the paperwork than by the man. The house finally sold at auction 14 months after the gala. The proceeds split between Ivy and the federal restitution fund set up for Weston's defrauded investors, and Ivy donated her portion of the leftover furniture to a domestic violence shelter 2 counties over rather than sell it, because she said she couldn't stand the idea of anyone paying her money for anything that had come out of that house. There was a night, about a month into all of it, when Ivy and I sat on my apartment floor with a bottle of wine we barely touched, going through old photos on her phone, and she stopped on one from their wedding, the 2 of them under a string of lights at the vineyard, Weston mid-laugh, Ivy looking up at him with an expression I recognized now as genuine, uncomplicated love, the kind that existed before any of the rest of it started. She stared at that photo for a long time. "I loved him," she said. "The real him, or the him I thought was real. I don't know which." I didn't try to talk her out of the grief. Some Some things you're allowed to mourn even after you understand you were right to leave them. I just sat next to her on the floor and let her look at the photo as long as she needed to. And when she finally put the phone down, she cried in a way that had nothing to do with fear for the first time in longer than either of us could remember. The legal side dragged on for months after that. Asset division complicated by the fact that half of what Weston claimed to own had, it turned out, been built partly on money he'd stolen from his own investors, which meant Ivy's divorce settlement got tangled up in a federal financial investigation that Renata described more than once as the messiest case I've had in 15 years, and also possibly the most satisfying. Weston was indicted on wire fraud and embezzlement charges 9 months after the gala. Ivy's name came up exactly twice in the resulting news coverage, both times as the man's wife, which she said, reading the article at my kitchen table, felt like the last small insult of a marriage built entirely on other people's understanding of who she was in relation to him. It's been almost 2 years now since the night I got that text. Ivy lives 40 minutes from me now, in a small rental with a kitchen too small for the table she wants, and a landlord who's slow about the heat. And she says it's the first home in 5 years that has felt entirely, unambiguously hers. She went back to the physical therapy clinic part-time last spring, then full-time by fall, and she tells me she likes the work more now than she did before. Though I think what she actually likes is having a paycheck that belongs to no one but her. She started therapy of her own about 4 months after the gala, a woman named Priya, who specializes in coercive control. And Ivy still texts me sometimes after a session with a single line, hard one today, that I've learned means she wants company more than conversation. I show up. We don't always talk about Weston. Sometimes we just eat takeout on her floor and watch something forgettable until the hard parts of her day soften enough for her to sleep. She's dating again, carefully, slowly, a man named Theo. She met through a coworker, and the 2 times I've watched them together, I noticed the thing I used to watch for without knowing I was watching for it. Whether her laugh comes on time, whether her eyes flick toward him first before she lets herself feel something. It comes on time now. It isn't checking for permission, it's just a laugh. My mother and Ivy have found their way back to something, not what they had before, but something honest, which might be better. My mother went to 2 sessions of a support group for family members of abuse survivors before she decided, on her own, that she needed more than 2 sessions, and she's still going, 18 months later, and she stopped saying things like, marriage is complicated in that particular tone that used to make my skin crawl. My father has never once brought up the fact that he was fooled by Weston for 3 years, and I think that's its own kind of apology, the kind some men give by simply never needing credit for changing. Vivian reached out to me directly, eventually, about a year after the gala, a short email, careful, guarded, thanking me for what she called finishing something I didn't have the resources to finish myself. She didn't want to meet, and I didn't push. Some people build their whole recovery around distance, and I've learned enough now to respect that as its own valid shape of survival. I think about her sometimes, a woman 3 states away who ran and cut off her own family rather than risk being found, who spent 8 years receiving quiet payments from a man still trying to manage the consequences of what he'd done to her. And I think about how close the whole thing came to staying buried, how close Weston came to marrying a 3rd woman and a 4th, cycling through the same pattern in a new house with a new folder and a new locked drawer. If a heavyset business partner hadn't had one too many scotches at exactly the right moment. Doug Aldrich, for what it's worth, ended up testifying against Weston in the fraud case, sitting through 2 full days of cross-examination without once trying to soften what he'd found in those books. He told me once, months later, over coffee I insisted on paying for, that he'd spent 5 years telling himself the version of Weston that made him comfortable, the hardworking, self-made guy, because it was easier than asking harder questions about a business partner he genuinely liked. I should have asked about the first wife a long time ago, he said. Everybody kind of knew there was one. Nobody wanted to be the guy who brought it up. I didn't tell him it was fine. It wasn't. Not really. But I understood, better than I wanted to, how a whole community can build a comfortable silence around a man, simply because asking questions is harder than accepting his version of himself. Weston is serving 4 years on the fraud charges, a sentence that has nothing to do with what he actually did to 2 women, in 2 kitchens, in 2 different houses, a fact that still sits wrong in my chest some nights. The legal system had language for stolen money. It never quite found language for what he took from Ivy that couldn't be totaled on a spreadsheet. 3 years of a version of herself that apologized for rain, that learned to time her own laughter, that genuinely believed some days that she deserved what she got for texting her sister back too fast. I don't know what the right sentence is for that. I don't think one exists. I still have Ivy's recorder. It sits in a drawer in my apartment, dead now, the battery long since given out, and I've thought more than once about throwing it away, and I've never quite been able to. It feels less like an object now and more like a record of something. 3 weeks a woman spent choosing survival over safety, choosing evidence over escape because the world she lived in required her to prove her own pain before anyone would help her carry it. I keep it the way you'd keep a scar you're not ashamed of. Proof that something happened. Proof that it ended. Ivy and I don't use frog talk anymore. Not really. Though sometimes, at the end of a long phone call, one of us will say lily pad instead of goodbye, just to hear the other one laugh, just to remind ourselves what that language was actually for. We built it in a treehouse when we were 7 and 10 years old. 2 kids who needed a way to say I'm scared without saying the words out loud. And I used to think we'd outgrown outgrown it, the way you outgrow anything from childhood that stops being useful. I don't think that anymore. I think some things you build to survive a house never really stop being useful. You just hope, for as long as you can, that you'll never need them again. I know how the story looks from the outside. The coded text, the recorder in the clutch, the ballroom confrontation with 300 witnesses. It has the shape of a triumph, and in a lot of ways, it is one. My sister is alive and safe and laughing on time again. Weston is behind bars, at least for a little while, for at least some of what he did. But I think about Vivian sometimes, 3 states away, still not ready to be found in person. And I think about the 8 years it took for the truth to catch up to a man who'd already gotten away with it once. I think about how much luck was involved. A drunk business partner, a manila folder I happened to glimpse 8 months earlier, a childhood code language that happened to still live somewhere in both our memories 15 years later. It shouldn't take that much luck for a woman to be believed. That's the part of this story I keep coming back to. More than the confrontation, more than the ending. Not the 4 words that saved my sister's life, though I'll be grateful for those 4 words for as long as I live. It's the 3 years before them. The years my mother told me I was jealous. The years I told myself I was imagining things. The years Ivy apologized for rain. We had a code for danger when we were children, built out of nothing but 2 scared kids in a treehouse, and it took us 15 years to need it again. And when we did, it worked, but only because I happened to still remember it. Only because she happened to still trust it enough to send it. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't recognized those 4 words. I try not to think about it too often. But some nights when Ivy calls just to talk about nothing, about her new apartment or a bad day at work or a dinner reservation with Theo, I find myself listening for something underneath her voice anyway. An old habit I don't think I'll ever fully lose. And every time, for 2 years running now, I hear exactly what I'm listening for. Nothing. Just my sister, sounding like herself again.